Well, I don't know about you, but I've actually found this sermon series on living generously enormously challenging. If you recall, in the last couple of weeks alone, we've looked at living generously in our relationships and the challenge of forgiveness, living generously, knowing that our time, talent, and treasure belong to God. And so, how does God want us to use these as we seek to love Him and our neighbour? And so I feel I must give you a little bit of a warning that the passage that we're looking at together this morning is no exception to the challenge. But I also want to say that in my view, it's as encouraging as it's stretching. So we're in Luke's Gospel this morning again, and we're looking today together at Luke chapter 14, verses 7 to 14, under the title of Living Generously, Giving Ourselves by Opening Our Doors. In other words, it's about hospitality. Some people have actually called Luke's Gospel the Gospel of Hospitality because there are more mealtime scenes with Jesus or events around food and Jesus in Luke's Gospel than in any of the other Gospels. So let's start by reading together this particular passage. If you have a Bible handy, do turn to Luke chapter 14. We'll be reading from verse 7. But just before we get to it, it's just worth noticing the context for the passage we're about to read, which is described right at the beginning of the chapter. It's a Sabbath, and Jesus has been invited to eat at the home of a prominent Pharisee. And as you know, Jesus regularly ate at lots of different people's houses, and you may recall also that he was criticized about some of the people he hung out with. In Luke 7, verse 34, for example, we're told that some people called him a glutton and a drunkard, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus also hung out with people of status as well. So earlier in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, Jesus is again with another prominent Pharisee in his home. And that's the occasion, if you recall, where Luke describes the sinful woman washing Jesus's feet with her tears, drying them with her hair, and anointing Jesus's feet with perfume. So I guess it's fair to say that Jesus is always a memorable dinner guest. Wherever he was, there was usually some drama, something was upended, and it was usually something rather challenging as well as often very beautiful. So here we are, immediately before the passage we're going to read now, Jesus in the home of another Pharisee having a meal, and he's just challenged all the dinner guests by healing on the Sabbath right in front of them. And they're silenced by his questions. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that the Bible tells us that Jesus was being carefully watched. But now as we come to verse 7, we discover that in actual fact, the tables are turned and Jesus has been carefully watching his fellow guest and perhaps unsurprisingly has something to say. So let's read from verse 7. Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests, for all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. I think one of the challenges for us in 21st century UK is the enormous gap in our understanding and experience of sharing food together compared with the experience and significance of sharing a meal in Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, these kinds of means were pregnant with meaning around status in society, power and privilege, in the world. So whose house you were invited to, how you were treated, where you sat in the pecking order around the table. They all said something about how people saw you, your worth and influence, where you were, if you like, in the pecking order of life, and how you were expected to reciprocate. And of course, your status would determine other aspects of your life in relation to your work, your income, who you could associate with, who you could marry. So there were lots of social dynamics in play, which essentially made your worth really clear. So it's no wonder that Jesus so often disrupted meals with stories and behavior that demonstrated the radical difference of God's kingdom. No wonder he practiced a radical inclusiveness around the meal table that shocked people, but made the wonder of the gospel a joy to those who mostly found themselves excluded in society, and was a profound challenge to those who did have power and privilege. No wonder Jesus used those opportunities of the meal table to kind of train his followers in the new manners, the values and community that conform to this upside down kingdom of God. In the first part of our reading, Jesus speaks to his dinner guests. I know in this particular context, we understand it to be people who would probably see themselves as socially privileged and were clearly social climbers, scrambling for the best seats in the house. And Jesus uses the parable of a wedding feast to challenge them around pride. And he concludes with that punchline in verse 11, that everyone who exalts themselves will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And as you'll know, it's a familiar theme in the Bible, these warnings against pride and this call to humility. And perhaps for you, you hear the echoes of Philippians 2, where Paul writes to those early Christians and says, your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ, who, being very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. Perhaps you're reminded of that Last Supper with his disciples, where Jesus got up from the dinner table and took a towel and a bowl of water, and one by one washes the feet of the disciples, and performing that role of a servant to guests at the master's table. It's a wonderful reminder to us, to all of us, rich or poor, high-ranking or low-ranking in society, that none of that stuff is significant around the table with Jesus. None of us are around his table because of our inherent worth. Our honored status is a gift conferred by God. It's a gift of grace. It's a love gift to all who would receive it, no matter who we are. So on this day, perhaps particularly because it's Pentecost Sunday as well, is receive that gift of being invited around Jesus' table with thanksgiving. Know that you are invited, you are loved, you're of inestimable value and worth in Jesus' eyes, and that you belong. And then as we think about the rest of this reading this morning, perhaps we, as it were, pick up our towel and our bowl and imitate Christ, God's humble servants, the one who ate with the excluded and marginalized, the lonely and broken, who made space for them and who served. In that second part of our reading today, Jesus then turns to his host and says, when you're feasting, invite the poor, the cripples, the lame, the blind, those who can't repay you, and you'll be blessed. Our 21st century practices of sharing food are so different to Jesus's day. Sometimes we don't always even eat around a table, and the same social dynamics aren't in play in quite the same way, but the challenge is the same. Who will we make space for in our lives around our tables? Who will we notice? Who will we serve? 21st century Britain may have an NHS that's the envy of the world, with the crippled, the lame, the blind offered help in ways that were unknown in Jesus's time. But we've a loneliness epidemic in our country. We've serious mental health challenges, increasingly amongst the young. In that little conversation with Graham from Restore Hope, we see that there are families in crisis on our doorstep, and there are probably people in our workplaces who tend to be ignored or who are suffering in some way. There are probably people in our extended families who are awkward or difficult. People in our church family who don't yet feel that they truly belong. And so I find it interesting that we're looking as a church together at this question of hospitality on a day when we're celebrating the next step in our national roadmap to freedom from the restrictions of the last years. Our Latimer communities are gathering in person today, probably in different ways than we've been able to do in previous weeks. There's a place to go for lunch for everyone today, and we'll explain about more about that right at the end. Those of us who've been around together for a little while will recall that hospitality has been really central to our life as a church over the years, but it feels a little bit like it's a muscle that we've not exercised for a while. And I imagine that for all of us, probably our hospitality has narrowed through the months of the pandemic. And so it's a muscle that we need to use again so that we can strengthen it. We need to practice hospitality. I also find it interesting that we're looking at this passage on Pentecost Sunday, the day when we remember and we celebrate and we re-engage with that first giving of the Spirit, a day that's often known as the birthday of the church, as Chris recalled at the beginning. Because I think the question that's raised from the scriptures to us today is a really important one for us all. What kind of church do we want to be? What do we want to be known for? Jesus' radical, inclusive hospitality created spaces for healing, for fellowship, for celebration, for receiving forgiveness, for worship, for prophetic confrontation, meeting practical needs, meeting the need to belong, and most of all, for receiving and living out God's love and grace. And it was as messy as it was wonderful. And I wonder, is this what we want to be known for? A kind of countercultural, generous hospitality that's costly and messy, but is a mark of the life of Jesus amongst us and a testimony to the power of the Spirit. For we cannot be such a church without his power at work in us. There's a longer version of the interview with Graham Wakeman from Restore Hope that will be, I think, posted on our Facebook page this week. And I'd love you to listen to it. He tells other stories about how God has worked amongst them. And one of the stories that he tells is how God provided a van that they needed. And the way that Graham tells the story is that they ask one another, do we believe that God can provide this van for us? And they agree that absolutely, God was perfectly able to do that. So they decided to pray this: how, Lord, would you like to provide this van for us? And you'll need to watch the video to find out how wonderfully God did do that. And I guess as we just come to having some time in our groups together, I think that's what I'd like us to consider and to pray about in our groups, this how question. Because when I think about, do I believe that God can help us be a church that's known for radically loving and grace-filled, inclusive, practical hospitality? Absolutely. I really believe that. So I wonder, are we willing to ask and pray the how question? How do you want me to reach out to people in my workplace, in my family, amongst my friends at church, make space for them? Is there a coffee needed, an invitation to a meal, conversation on a walk? That's a question to us individually. And then perhaps a question for our groups. How can we exercise our hospitality muscles in our community groups and use our dinner tables, our kitchen tables, our picnic tables to make space for people? And then perhaps finally, for us all together, how, Lord, would you like us to become a church that's marked by a kingdom hospitality that makes space for those who need to know God's hope, God's healing, and God's lavish grace. May it be so.